Chapter 14, Timberland Part 2, $5 Day, Monday, January 12, 1914. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford and his business manager, James Couzens, invited the Detroit newspaper press to the Highland Park Ford Motor Company plant. "I would like to announce the following new policies the Ford Motor Company will be adopting immediately," Mr. Couzens began as his boss Henry stood and just looked out the window. "Number 1, we are reducing the workday from 9 hours to 8. This will allow the workers to spend more time with their families. Number 2, instead of just 2 daily work shifts, we will be increasing it to 3, which will mean more men will have to be hired." The reporters began talking to each other, excited about the big news story they would be reporting to their readers. After they settled down, Mr. Couzens cleared his throat, because he knew this next announcement would really shock the reporters. "The third new policy is effective on January 12th, when we are doubling the basic pay rate for most workers to $5 a day." A loud gasp came from the gathered audience. This announcement caught all of the reporters by surprise. Offering this amount of money to workers made some of them express disbelief. Mr. Couzens assured them this was not a joke or a publicity stunt. He then listed rules that had to be followed in order for the workers to be eligible for the $5 a day. All married men, men under 22 who were supporting widowed mothers, brothers, or sisters, and all women who were supporting families would receive the raise. Unmarried men and women without dependents would not qualify for the $5. At the end of the meeting, the reporters rushed out to write one of the biggest news stories that had ever happened in Detroit, or for that matter, in the world. The following day, Melinda stared at her husband sitting in his favorite rocking chair, looking out the window as the snow gently fell. Ever since his heart problem when he had to give up his career as a bricklayer, he talked about the next exciting adventure that was in store for him. That's what she loved about her husband. He always had a positive outlook on life. A knock on the door awoke Melinda from her thoughts. When she opened it, standing on the porch was her paper boy. He usually just left the paper, and since today wasn't time for him to collect, she was surprised to see him. "Hello, Mrs. Perry, did you hear the news? Mr. Henry Ford is going to pay his workers $5 a day. Can you believe it? He's going to make everybody in Detroit rich. I had to knock on your door to let you know the great news. Here's your newspaper, ma'am," he said excitedly as he jumped to the ground and ran next door to tell Melinda's neighbors. Melinda looked at the Detroit Journal newspaper in her hand and read the incredible headline: "Henry Ford gives $10 million in 1914 profits to his employees." She hurried into the house, calling her husband. Will, look at this. You won't believe it." Will, sensing the excitement in her voice, quickly got out of his chair and hurried to meet her. "Look what your friend Henry Ford is doing," she said, handing him the paper. Will read the headline, then smiled and said, "Henry was always one of the most honest and fair men I ever knew, so I'm not surprised. He was never motivated by the money when building his car, but he was wise enough to know that his workers are consumers. He also knows it's only right they can afford the products that they make. Henry always told me he wanted the ordinary man to be able to travel across America by car." "Why don't you go down to the Highland Park plant? He's your friend, so maybe he will give you a job. With your ailing heart, you can't do bricklaying anymore," Melinda said. "I wouldn't want to impose on our friendship," Will said, although he knew Henry wouldn't think he was imposing. "Besides, once this news spreads, people will be coming to Detroit from all over the world looking for a job, and he will be a very busy man." Melinda agreed, but then she reminded him, "You know, there are no colored people that work at Ford Motor Company. You could be the first and open the door for more of our people to get jobs, not only colored, but others that may be disadvantaged." "I'll think about it, but first I want to see the reaction to this fantastic news," Will said to his wife as he reached for her hand. "Come on, sweetheart, and sit beside me so I can read the newspaper story to you and see what this is all about." That evening, while Will lay in bed, he thought about his conversation with Melinda. He was 61 now, and other than his slightly weakened heart, he felt strong, and it was time he stopped sitting in his rocker. This was what he was waiting for. He decided that after a few weeks he would go and see Henry Ford. In the early morning of February 9th, 1914, Will Perry stood in the doorway of his home and kissed his wife and two children, Hattie and Olive, goodbye. They waved to him as he walked down the icy road to catch the trolley to the Highland Park Ford Motor Company plant on Woodward Avenue. While riding along in the trolley, he began thinking back to 1888 and the day he saved Henry Ford's life and Henry hired him to work on his Timberland. They became friends from that day on. Will was not nervous about going to see Henry because it didn't matter if he got a job or not. He just looked forward to seeing his friend. When he arrived at the Highland Park plant, he was astonished by the size of the building. He learned later that it was designed by an up-and-coming architect, Albert Kahn, who had previously designed the Packard Motor Car Company. His design of the Ford factory was different from all previous buildings that were used in industry. Instead of separate functions being performed in different buildings, the entire assembly of the Ford Model T was done under one roof. The main four-story building was 75 feet wide by 865 feet long. There was another one-story building with a sawtooth roof, which was 140 feet wide and 840 feet long and ran parallel to the main building. The two buildings were connected with a glass-roofed craneway that ran the entire length and was used for transferring material from one building to the other in order to build the car. What impressed Will the most was the 50,000 square feet of glass windows which made up almost 75% of the wall area. All of this glass resulted in the Highland Park plant being nicknamed the Crystal Palace. Even though it was over 3 weeks since the announcement of the $5 day, there were still a lot of men outside the plant gates hoping to be hired. All of the jobs for the 3 shifts had been filled long ago, but that didn't matter to the men waiting. They knew if they did get lucky, their lives and the lives of their families would change forever. After seeing all the people, Will realized his only chance of getting hired was to speak directly to Henry Ford, so he approached the guard at the gate. "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me where the office of Henry Ford is?" Will asked. "Why do you want to know where Mr. Ford's office is, buddy?" the guard asked as he stood with his hands on his hips looking at Will. "My name is William Perry, and I'm a friend of his," Will answered. The guard began laughing and laughing. Finally, he calmed down long enough to say, "Look here, buddy, I think you better move along. Mr. Ford is a busy man. He doesn't have time to visit with his friends." He burst out laughing again. Will thanked the guard and began walking away. "Excuse me," someone said. "Did you say your name was William Perry?" "Yes," Will said, turning in the direction of the man who spoke. A young man in a suit and tie approached Will, then reached out and shook his hand. The gentleman in the suit and tie continued talking. "I've heard Mr. Ford talk about you on several occasions. Come with me. I'm sure Mr. Ford will want to see you." Will followed the man, and as they passed through the gates, the guard who had heard their conversation stood looking after them with his mouth wide open. When they had arrived inside the factory, the man with the suit and tie said, "I'll go up to the administration offices and let Mr. Ford know you are here." Will thanked the gentleman, then stood there watching all the machinery and activity going on around him as he waited. The man returned several minutes later and told Will that Mr. Ford wanted to see him. When Will walked into his office, Henry jumped out of the big leather chair behind his desk and walked over to him, extending his hand. "Well, well, well, it is you. When the power plant superintendent said Mr. William Perry was here to see me, I didn't believe it. How are you doing, my friend?" "I'm doing fine, Henry. Had a little problem with my heart last year, but I feel much better now," Will told him. "Sorry to hear that. Of course you can't do bricklaying anymore because the work would be too hard. Why don't you come and work for me? I know I've asked you before, but now you can come and earn $5 a day," Ford said, smiling. Will couldn't believe that Henry offered him a job before he had a chance to even ask, but that was typical of Henry. He always seemed to sense when a person wanted or needed something, and he was always quick to fulfill that person's wish. Let me give you a tour of the factory and the assembly line, and then I will show you the machinery in the power plant where you will be working. Can you start immediately? Henry asked. Yes, I can, Will said. This reminds me of old times when you came to work on my Timberland, Henry said as Will began following Ford. Do you remember when we built our square house? Henry asked. I remember all right, Will said, laughing, especially that day when you had an explosion in your workshop and Miss Claire and I ran into the barn to see what happened. Well, we are building a new house now, and I don't have to worry about working on the engines like I used to, Henry said. You're building a new home? Will asked. Yes, we have 1,300 acres just a couple miles from where I was born. I've hired several hundred masons, woodcarvers, and artisans, and they began this month and intend to work year-round to complete the 56-room house, which I'm going to call Fairlane. Callie is also hiring Jens Jensen, a noted landscape architect, to turn the farmland into a natural native environment, Henry said. Why are you calling it Fairlane? Will asked. It's named after the road leading past the fairgrounds to the birthplace of my foster grandfather, Patrick O'Hearn, in County Cork, Ireland, Henry added. But enough about house building. Let me show you our factory. Will listened to Henry explain things as they walked around the plant floor. Henry told him about the previous factory on Piquette Street. After selling over 10,000 cars from 1908 to 1909, we needed a bigger factory, so I bought these 60 acres in Highland Park just outside Detroit. He explained that in the main building, the first floor was divided into different areas, which focused on the axles, camshafts, crankshafts, and connecting rods. The second floor was used to assemble the car body, areas for repairing parts, and the shipping, drafting, pattern, and experimental departments. Henry's office and the rest of the administration offices were connected to this floor with a walkway. The third floor was for the wheels, lamps, floorboards, painting, and the trim for the car body. The fourth floor is where the fenders, radiators, fuel tanks, hoods, and upholstery departments were located. Across the craneway in a one-story building, they prepared the cylinders, cylinder heads, piston rings, differential gears, gear cases, and assembly of the engine. A 3,000 horsepower gas engine turning huge generators distribute electrical power throughout the plant to keep all the machines operating. I was inspired to use the assembly line concept when I visited a watch factory where the parts sat on a moving belt and traveled from one worker to another. A similar system was used in the Chicago meatpacking plant when they moved the meat on an overhead trolley, Henry said. He went on to tell Will his first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, was started in 1889 and lasted until January 1901. That same year, the Henry Ford Company was started, but since he never had total control, it too went out of business. To prevent another company from closing, I knew something had to be done. So with $28,000 in capital, the Ford Motor Company was established. I invested my own money so I wouldn't have any partners to answer to. My new company began assembling the Model A until 1908, and that's when the Model T was introduced. Come with me, and I'll show you where we first experimented with the assembly line on April 1st of last year. There are two general principles in the assembly line operation that increases its efficiency. Number one is that a person never takes more than one step to get his part, and number two, no one needs to ever stoop over to reach for a part, Henry said as the two men continued walking around the plant floor. This is the flywheel magneto department, where men and women stand alongside this smooth metal table where one part is installed, then slid along to the next worker where he or she puts on the next part. The magnetos are devices with magnets, which generate current for the ignition process. We now use this assembly system throughout the plant, increasing productivity and reducing costs by as much as 5 times. I realized early on that it takes more than one man to build a business. It takes thousands to contribute, and this is why I'm sharing the profits with the workers and paying them $5 a day. When we worked together on your Timberland, you predicted you would one day provide an automobile for the masses, and you have. Thank you for hiring me. I can't believe I'm going to work for the most revolutionary company in the world, the Ford Motor Company, Will said as he shook Henry's hand in gratitude. "William Perry," Henry began speaking, "your friendship has had a significant influence on me ever since you saved my life when that madman attacked me with an axe. Finally, our years working together on my Timberland made me realize that colored and whites can work together in harmony, just like we did when you were on one end of the crosscut saw and I was on the other. So I have to thank you, Will. I am so proud and happy you are now part of the Ford family." Henry called the powerhouse superintendent over. "William Perry works with me now. He has a slight heart ailment, so please see that he's comfortable. Mr. Perry is one of my best friends, and I'm very interested in this person. Come with us to the office, and we will give him an employment application, and I also want to give him the keys to a new Model T car. He will need transportation to get to work every day. You can choose any color you want, Will, as long as it's black." The three men began laughing, because everyone knew the Model T only came in the color black. That evening, while sitting at the dinner table, Will told Melinda all about the events of the day. "Mr. Ford is truly a good friend," Melinda said. "That was so nice of him to hire you. And just think, you're the first colored person to work for the Ford Motor Company. He even gave us a new car." "Unbelievable," was all Will could say. After supper, as Will sat in his rocking chair looking out the window, his thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He remembered the days sitting in the big oak tree in the front yard of his parents' home. He remembered going to Amherstburg, then Detroit to get a job on the railroad, working on the cookie car, seeing the Transcontinental Railroad completed, farming on the Perry family farms, Timberland, the Flying Clipper, and bricklaying. Who would have guessed that a person from a small community like the Elmstead Pew Settlement, just outside of Windsor, Ontario, Canada, could have so many experiences? Will smiled as he continued rocking. Life had been good, and it looked like it was getting even better.